Hello and welcome back to the Americano Show. I'm delighted to be joined by the great Christopher Caldwell, who is a columnist for the Spectator's World Edition and a contributing editor for the Claremont Review of Books. He's also the author of many fascinating books, which I recommend you should all read. Chris, let's talk about a piece you've written for the New York Times about Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, and also the Secretary of War, as he's been renamed.
Yes.
Or he's added that title to his roster. He gave this speech recently where he summoned all of America's military top brass. And there was a lot of intrigue about it because people thought, oh, is America about to declare war on Venezuela? What's going on? It seemed like an odd move. And then he gave quite a punchy speech that made a lot of headlines because he said some rude things about the generals. He suggested that the American military was overweight.
It's tiring to look out at combat formations, or really any formation, and see fat troops. Likewise, it's completely unacceptable to see fat generals and admirals in the halls of the Pentagon and leading commands around the country and the world. It's a bad look.
But you've written a piece for the New York Times saying that you think it was a pretty good speech, actually, overall.
Well, for what it tried to do, it certainly was. I think that the earliest criticism to come out about it was that it was frivolous. I mean, I think people seized on those remarks about where he said, "Hey, no one wants to see a fat general," and he used a lot of vulgar vocabulary too, with like swear words, and he acted like Hegseth is a guy who I think he rose to a rank of major. I don't know if that's a distaff rank or whatever you call it nowadays. But he was not really top brass in the army. But Trump discovered him through Fox News, where Hegseth was a commentator. Hegseth's, let's say, adversaries or detractors really like to paint him as a superficial person, and they looked at this speech as as more of the same. But actually, the argument that I make is that the military is undergoing a major cultural shift under Trump, and it was incumbent on Hegseth to explain it. And this is exactly what you would summon your major general officers back to Washington about.
Well, let's get on to the substance of the speech, or the substance you want to talk about, or you wrote about. But let's just address the fat line, because I wondered whether it was to do with that America's birthday military parade that went through Washington.
Oh.
And it was sort of hyped up. Yeah. And then it got widely mocked on social media. Donald Trump obviously saw it, and beforehand it was sort of billed as, this is America becoming an authoritarian country, military parades are for North Korea and so on. But then it happened, and it was sort of pleasingly, I thought, a bit shambolic. And I wondered whether Trump might have been a little bit miffed at the sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Corporal state of U.S.
Yeah, that's very English of you to like a kind of shambolic army. It's the Noel Coward song, the "Would you please oblige us with a Bren gun?" It's a sort of great World War II song, but yeah, I think fitness is big for Hegseth. I think because he likes fitness. He's got a lot of, when he was nominated, there were a lot of pictures of him, sort of like pumping iron and that kind of thing. But also, if we want to get to the substance of what he said, the main element of what he was brought in to do, and this was clear when he was nominated, and the main thing he talked about last week was to remove DEI, to remove affirmative action, to remove sort of like diversity-oriented recruitment from the Army.
No more identity months, DEI offices, dudes in dresses. No more climate change worship. No more division, distraction, or gender delusions. No more debris. As I've said before, and will say again, we are done with that shit.
What Hegseth wants is standards, and particularly fitness standards. And he feels, and there's no denying it, that standards were revised in the course of opening the military up to the army, up to women. I'm sorry. So he's a lot of this speech was about standards. And I think that the fat business was a way maybe of obscuring how much of a rollback of women in the military that this will be de facto. He rightly says these standards are not sexist. They're just standards. If women can pass them, fine. But he also says if women can't pass them, and in fact, if there are no women in some of these units, well, then so be it. But it's a neutral, objective standard. I think that by saying, well, look, you can't get in these sort of like demanding units if you're a fat, aged out man either, or a weak man, I think is the way he phrased it. I think doing that makes it softens the blow of a little bit.
Well, and as you say in your piece, this taps into something rather crucial about America since the Civil Rights Act, which is that equality has become muddled with something like leveling, particularly when you look at something like the military, which ought to obviously be about finding people to do a very important job and therefore finding the best people to do it because it's lethal and it's awful and it has to be done quickly and ruthlessly. There isn't really room for diversity quotas in the military, or at least there shouldn't be. And in fact, as you say, in a way that makes the military, the armed forces of the United States, a very good ground for an egalitarian society.
That's right. And this is where I think that the speech was not only worth giving, but actually was well kind of conceptualized. Because, this argument about, there are a number of arguments about why the excessive quest for diversity is wrong. And some of them involve freedom of speech, which I think are freedom of association, which I think are the real constitutional arguments. And some of them involve meritocracy, which is the grounds on which the Trump administration has wanted to argue. I think it's true in all walks of life that it's really demoralizing not to be able to take on the best people as the head of a company or any other enterprise sees fit. And even if you make the progressive argument that, well, affirmative action is just outreach and you're going to wind up with great people anyway, even if you accept that, to have someone interfering in your decision and your judgment of who the best people are is very, very demoralizing. But let's just say progressives have been able to make the argument for many decades that, well, it's worth it in the long run to society. Hegseth very expertly, I thought, focused on the military as a place where that's simply not true. And he, the way he did it was he was very graphic about the sort of like the violence and the deadliness of life in the military. There are misfortunes in all walks of life, but the military is about killing, and it's about, and it's meant to be about killing. And that's a very grim thing to think about. But once you think about it, he then took a next step and he said, I'd like you to think about what you would want for your son. Okay, let's see. He said, I have a 15-year-old son. Put your son into, in your mind, into a military unit, and just ask yourself if you want the people who are leading him into battle or covering him in battle to have been promoted for any other reason than their competence in battle. And I think the answer is no, he said. And I think that was actually it was really strong.
Well, he loves talking about lethality. He uses that word a lot.
He does.
And warriors. He likes saying warriors.
And war fighters, to me, really, war fighters is the unusual word that people have pointed out. Yeah.
War fighters.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I suppose that's what they are meant to be.
We're training warriors, not defenders. We fight wars to win, not to defend. We untie the hands of our war fighters to intimidate, demoralize, hunt, and kill the enemies of our country.
I do sometimes wonder if this this sort of talk of lethality and so on, it becomes a kind of, and I think this also when I see on his social media feed, he likes posting videos of ships being blown up in the water. I do wonder whether it becomes very performative, social media oriented. And of course, this feeds into a big criticism of him, which is that he's a Fox News host, so it's all about the presentation and not about the substance. But perhaps you disagree.
No, I don't know that I do. I don't really have a great deal of experience watching him on Fox. I don't know how it fits together with that part of his life. I think that all politics has a tendency to get performative, as you say, but I don't know that Hegseth's a worse offender than other people.
Mm. Well, let's go back to the sort of women in the army, gays in the army, because there was a very big debate in the Clinton era, as you mentioned in your piece, about gay men or women in the army. And I think they adopted this "don't say, don't tell."
Yes, yeah, it's a funny thing. It's a good measure of the way the diversity and inclusion have changed since the start of the Civil Rights Act of the 1950s, which, as you know, was aimed primarily at solving the historic American problem of racial segregation and wound up being used for other things. And it just made a lot of sense to use the civil rights laws that way, at least for Democrats. And so when Bill Clinton came into office in 1992, as you may remember, may not remember, but as you know from history, he got only 43% of the vote. He didn't come in on a landslide, but the opposition was divided between Bush and Perot. But Clinton was a relatively conservative Democrat, but he had a lot of ideas from the leftmost edge of the party. And one was that gays could be let's just say, gays who professed their homosexuality in public could be introduced into public life in the same way that blacks had been in the preceding decades. And so he started his administration with this movement to put gays in the military, to say you can serve as an open gay in the military, thinking it would be non-problematic. It turned into like the great catastrophe. It turned the opening days of his presidency into the most catastrophic opening of any presidency. It's actually a historically blundering first 100 days. There's never really been anything like it before or since. Gays in the military was key, but he wound up resolving it by through something which was, as you say, called "Don't Ask, Don't Tell," and it meant like, we're going to wink at gays in the military. So to you, gays, you are welcome to come in and fight for your country. However, we don't want anyone to talk about it. So to you, social conservatives and Christians, you can just accept that there have always been people with these inclinations in the army, but we're not going to talk about it now any more than we did, so there's really no change. It was a classic Clinton thing. It was a real change masquerading as a non-change. But by the time of Obama, there was much more momentum behind a robust kind of diversity thing. And he repealed "Don't Ask, Don't Tell," went on to open all combat positions to women, and even admit in his final years transgender people in the military.
Yeah. Well, I think Joe Biden's a good sort of barometer of the shift in democratic opinion, because I think when you go back to that debate in the Clinton era, Biden took a more conservative position. I can't remember the actual quote, but he had quite a quote that in hindsight is quite striking, saying, expressing discomfort with the idea of gay people in the military. And then you move forward to his presidency, and he becomes the man who elevates the first transgender admiral.
That's right, and says that transgender rights will be the civil rights of the 21st century. Yeah, Biden, that was Joe Biden. That is his career. He was a great weather vane of where the Democratic Party was. And as you know, also in the Clinton administration, he was a big one for cracking down on Black neighborhoods through really draconian prison sentencing. But he was able to just like shed that like a coat of feathers, and just move on to the next ideology. And it was his great gift as a president. It's not easy to do, to sort of convince your voters to forget what you were a year ago, and he really was gifted at it.
But in spite of all the DEI-ization of the American military, America still has a martial spirit in a way that a country like my own Britain just does not. I mean, we don't thank the troops regularly in Britain. We don't invoke some sort of special status towards the military in social events, social occasions, and things like that. Why do you think that has lingered in the American psyche, the importance of the army, particularly as you're not really meant to have one constitutionally?
I'm not sure I'd agree with you. I would say, having lived in England at the end of the 20th century, I was always struck by the way young men would come out of Oxford and Cambridge in a way that they would not come out of Harvard and Yale at all, and consider it a good career to serve as officers in the military for a couple of years, so that there was a respect for the military across all classes in England. I find the English totally obsessed with World War II. I think it has a sort of like their ideas of fairness sort of like come out of the war, not just the war, like the way it was conducted militarily. I think that what we're seeing in the United States is deeply shaped by something that you didn't have in England, which is the Vietnam War, and the experience of sending a lot of men, particularly working class men, off to fight and die, and then condemning the war and leaving them feeling condemned for fighting it when they returned. And that was, I mean, there was a lot of that in the 70s, and I think that people found it really unfair and were deeply ashamed. I think I think the country, I can almost not think of anything else in the last 75 years that the United States has been as ashamed of as the way it treated the Vietnam veterans. So when our veterans began to move into harm's way in other places, everyone was resolved, and I think the institutions were resolved to not let that happen again and to make sure that they felt appreciated. And so now there's like an incredible amount of it. I mean, you can't go to a football game without, 5 minutes beforehand of like introducing a whole bunch of active service people. And it's really, I mean, maybe it's even excessive now. One thing that I do think is excessive, which is a different story, is giving benefits to serving military, like letting them go to the front of the line and on airplanes and giving them bargain deals on coffee and delicatessens and things.
They're like monks in Nepal or something. Yeah.
Yes, but I think that it did. Our respect for the military, it's a very good. It's a very healthy adjustment to, I think, what was a really improper, let's say, selling them short or mistreating them in the wake of Vietnam.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. I think another striking thing to me about Hegseth, and if you look at someone like Tulsi Gabbard, or if you look at J.D. Vance, they're all people who served in one way or another in the war on terror, be that in Iraq or Afghanistan. And they are therefore, they have actual military experience. And there's a sort of sense that they are taking decisions as people who served as low-level officers in these wars that were disastrous for America. And therefore they know what they're talking about in a way that the top brass maybe didn't, and particularly in a way that the Washington politicians who ran departments of defense and so on did not.
Yes. From it's a return to the way things were in the immediate post-war, from the Dwight Eisenhower's presidency until the 1990s. Every president was a veteran of World War II. And then we went through a period in which that wasn't the case, in which military experience, we had 4, I think, consecutive presidents who were not veterans. And now we are getting into an age where, people who fought in actual military engagements are once again of presidential age. But I mean, these were a different kind of war. And after the Second World War, what the United States was doing was arguably, global policing. And that's why all of these wars feel like lost wars. I mean, we keep getting, told that this is a special war, a special reason to go and fight. And all of these wars wind up a little bit like Vietnam. So you wonder if Vietnam wasn't the unique debacle that we think it was, but it was just it's sort of like a different kind of projection of military force, coming from the idea that the United States benefited from global order, and we had to go out and, apply force in certain parts of the global order, and that ultimately this would benefit. This would benefit us. It's a very imperial way of looking at things.
And this is why you hear a lot of people who are involved in the State Department or the Defense Department under Trump's administration, second administration, you hear them talking about hemispheric interests, focusing on the Western Hemisphere, focusing on the war on drugs in Mexico and Venezuela and perhaps Colombia. It's a much more 19th century way of looking at the projection of power abroad.
Right. It's what used to be called the Monroe Doctrine, which is a theory of foreign affairs developed mostly by John Quincy Adams, I would say. The United States should be preeminent in its hemisphere. It should not allow foreign meddling in its hemisphere, which in the 19th century meant the European imperial powers. Now it seems to be leading us into a sort of like a revision of what's going on in South America, which China has, where China exerts a great influence. I think that the purpose of the Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century was a little different than it was now. Back then it was anti-imperial. Now it has these different reasons, but also the fact that we no longer have the economic and industrial preeminence to manage a global empire. I think the size of the empire that we can manage is shrinking, and I think we're sort of right-sizing the empire. The Americas is about the size of the Americas plus Europe is about the size of the empire we can manage.
Well, I'm rather relieved you said plus Europe. But Chris, I could talk to you forever, but we have to wrap it up there. But thank you very much for coming on. It's always fascinating to talk to you.
Oh, gosh. Thank you, Freddie.